From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am Carolyn Brown, Director of the Office of Scholarly Programs and the John W. Kluge Center here at the Library of Congress. And it gives me great pleasure to welcome you here this afternoon for today's lecture by Wesley Granberg-Michaelson entitled The Pilgrimage of World Christianity, a Post-Christian West and the Non-Western Church. But before we begin, let me ask you to please, if you have any cell phones or other electronic equipment that is apt to go off and interfere with the program, would you please turn it off or at least turn it to mute so it will not be disturbing. Today's event is presented by the John W. Kluge Center here at the Library of Congress. The center was established through a generous endowment grant by John W. Kluge to create a scholarly venue on Capitol Hill where the finest mature scholars and thinkers might have opportunities to meet with the nation's leaders, the thinkers and doers, as we like to say, a space where those two groups have the opportunity to come together in a way that they can share ideas and thinking in informal venues. The center also supports the rising generation of fine young scholars, and as part of our programs, our senior scholars and our postdoctoral fellows all give public presentations such as this one. We also will sometimes do small conferences and symposia. I invite you to sign up in the back of the room, if you would, for further information about the programs and opportunities at the Kluge Center. There's also a brochure back there as well. Today's speaker, Wesley Granberg-Michaelson, is the former General Secretary of the Reformed Church of America, a position that he held for 17 years. However, he is no stranger to Capitol Hill. He served 8 years as a legislative aide to U.S. Senator Mark Hatfield before not Mark Hatfield, but Granberg-Michaelson went on to the ministry as his career. He completed his theological education at Princeton Theological Seminary and then Western Theological Seminary in Holland, Michigan, served for 6 years as Director of Church and Society for the World Council of Churches in Geneva. He's written several books, including Inside Out, Spirituality and Organizational Change, and Unexpected Destinations, an Evangelical Pilgrimage to Western Christianity. At the Kluge Center, he's been studying the major shift in Christianity's presence from into the world of Africa, Asia, and Latin America, and some of the kind of challenges that poses for the whole notion of global Christianity. We're especially privileged because he's both then a practitioner who's had considerable experience from that side of the desk, you might say, in dealing with this issue, and then here at the Kluge Center in a role as scholar, reading and researching the issue. So it's a great opportunity to have someone with that kind of experience talking about this kind of question, which is such a pragmatic as well as interesting intellectual subject. So without further ado, please welcome our distinguished visiting scholar, Wesley Granberg-Michaelson.
Thank you very much, Carolyn. First of all, I want to thank the Library of Congress for the extraordinary opportunity that I've been able to have. As Carolyn said, I worked for some time on Capitol Hill, and during that time, I knew the Library of Congress as a resource. I've come to discover the Library of Congress as an incredible national treasure. And I have such profound respect for the colleagues who work here and for what this institution represents. My gratitude goes to first the librarian, Dr. James Billington, and for the leadership that he has given in the intellectual life of this nation, and the leadership he's given to this institution. And then to Carolyn Brown, the director of the Kluge Center. The John W. Kluge Center is just a real jewel. It's an amazing place that does some very helpful things, as she explained, and it's been just a thrill of my life to be a part of the John W. Kluge Center and what it has allowed. And the staff there who have been so helpful at every step of the way, Travis Hensley, Jason Steinhauer, Mary Lou Recker, Tracy Dobson, Sally Aronson, Denise Robinson, Jemiah Mosley, each one of them have gone out of their way to make me welcomed and comfortable and supported. So I thank them all. As you entered the Jefferson Building of the Library of Congress today, hopefully you passed through the Great Hall. Past the commemorative arch, two of the most valuable treasures of the library are on display. On the right is the giant Bible of Mainz. It's a magnificent example of the text of the Bible copied into pages and bound together in a process that would take 15 months to complete. On the left is the Gutenberg Bible. This, of course, was the first book in Europe printed with movable type. Both of these Bibles were produced in Mainz, Germany in the mid-1450s, but the technological difference between the two is a hinge point in history, dramatically altering the pilgrimage of world Christianity. Bibles produced like the giant Bible of Mainz, laboriously copied by hands, were kept the text of Scripture in the hands of well-educated clergy, as well as princes and nobles with enough money to pay for one. Before the advent of the printing press, the literacy rate amongst males in Europe was about 5 to 10%. But following Gutenberg's innovation, literacy rates rose to about 50%. The century which followed marked a decisive turn in the journey of Christianity. The democratization of the Bible dramatically altered patterns of authority, power, and governance in the life of the church. By the beginning of the 16th century, printing presses had expanded so rapidly that throughout Europe, volumes of printed materials and books appeared, estimating towards 20 million. And all of this was foundational to the spread of the Protestant Reformation. Today, the full Bible is translated into at least 450 languages and parts of Scripture into more than 2,500 tongues. Hundreds of millions of people read and study their own Bibles. With continuing technological change, those words are now held in smartphones and iPads. Christians take for granted this personalized, electronically ubiquitous access to Scripture. Yet, for the first 1,500 years of Christianity, the direct and personal availability of the Bible to believers was virtually unknown. This change marked a whole new trajectory in the pilgrimage of Christianity. Now today, 5 centuries later, Christianity is in the midst of another dramatic pilgrimage. Its most obvious expression is geographical. The center of world Christianity, in terms of sheer numbers of Christians and the growth of their churches, has moved decisively to the southern hemisphere, or the global south. Over the past century, this astonishing shift in the presence of the globe's Christian population is the most dramatic geographical change of this sort that has happened in 2,000 years of history. And the consequences of this change are just barely being imagined. But the shift is not simply about geography. It's also a shift in the culture and mindset shaping expressions of Christian faith. Changes far more difficult to map, but in the end, more decisive. So Christianity is not only moving from settled lands to new frontiers, it's also evolving from established forms and structures to fresh manifestations of its life and from dogmatic systems to spirit-filled discoveries. For today, the world is witnessing a post-Western awakening of Christianity. The majority of Christians now are living in societies that have freed themselves from the colonial power of the West. They are fashioning expressions of faith that can appropriately be called non-Western. So in many ways, we are witnessing the pilgrimage of Christianity moving out of the dominance of modern Western culture and beyond the framework of the modern Enlightenment. Of course, it's important to note immediately that several historic expressions of Christianity have never functioned in the framework of Western culture, most notably the Orthodox churches with their ancient presence in the Middle East, Asia, and elsewhere. But overall, we see a gravitational shift in the dominant places of Christianity's global presence. The pilgrimage geographically of Christianity took centuries to move to the global north. You can see from this map that it's possible to trace the statistical center of gravity for world Christianity, meaning to identify the point on the globe where an equal number of Christians are found to the north, south, east, and west at any given time. For almost the first millennium of Christianity, its center of gravity was in West Asia, and a majority of Christians were in the global south. Around the year 600, Christianity began its gradual but clear pilgrimage towards the north and the west, and you see how that line begins to go. But it wasn't until sometime in the 10th century, almost 1,000 years after Jesus was on earth, when a majority of Christians found themselves living in those regions. By the year 1000, Christianity's statistical center had moved near one of its great spiritual centers, Constantinople. 5 centuries later, by 1500, 92% of Christians were Northern Europeans. But at that point, world Christianity began a slow but steady path back towards the south. After 4 centuries, by 1900, its center of gravity had moved from Budapest, Hungary, which was its northernmost point that you see in the center, to Madrid, Spain, but still remained in the north. It was in the following 20th century that Christianity's geographic pilgrimage took the most pronounced, dramatic, and decisive change in direction in all of its history. Rapidly accelerating its turn to the south and then to the east, by 1980, there were more Christians in the global south than the north for the first time in 1,000 years. And the center of gravity was in Africa. Some key facts summarize these changes. In 1910, 66% of all Christians in the world lived in Europe. By 2010, only 26 lived there. In 1910, only 2% of Christians lived in Africa. Today, nearly 1 out of 4 Christians in the world is an African. Europe and North America, the global north, contained 80% of all Christians in 1910, 40% a century later. And Christianity's center of gravity by 2010 had moved to a point near Timbuktu in Mali. At the beginning of the last century, only a few million Christians were in Africa, less than 10% of its population. That has grown to about 494 million adherents to Christianity, or almost 50% of the continent's population, and over 70% in sub-Saharan Africa. By the year 2025, the overall Christian population of Africa is projected to swell to 633 million people. The trajectory of Christianity's pilgrimage, seen through its statistical center of gravity, moved not only dramatically to the south in the past century, but beginning in 1970, it also began returning east. This was caused by the rising number of Christians in Asia. Christianity grew at twice the overall population growth in Asia over the past century. China alone is estimated to have 115 million Christians today, and on any given Sunday, it is thought that there are more Christians attending worship services in China than in the United States. Surprises continue. More recently, countries like Nepal and Cambodia have witnessed rapid church growth, and after being nearly exterminated by Pol Pot, Christianity in Cambodia has grown by 7.2% in the last decade. Mongolia, once virtually closed to Christianity, now has blossoming and growing churches. In South Korea, Christianity has grown faster over the past century, at 6.1%, than anywhere else in Asia. From only about 500,000 Christians in 1910, the Korean church has grown to more than 20 million, or about 41% of the population. While 50% of the population in Asia was Buddhist in 1910, by 2010 that had dropped to 22%. The Muslim community has grown the fastest in that continent over the last century, with about 1 billion adherents, or about 1 out of every 4 Asians. Yet, in the last decade, Christianity has grown at a rate of 2.4%, faster than the growth of Muslims at 1.7%. So the overall Christian population in the Asian continent totals 350 million and is projected to grow to 460 million by the year 2025. Now to Latin America. In 1910, 95% of the Latin American population was Christian, primarily through the presence of the Catholic Church that had accompanied Spanish and Portuguese colonial rule. Only 1% of the Christian population was non-Catholic. The last 50 years, however, has seen the rapid and often astonishing growth of Pentecostalism in Latin America. By 2010, Latin America was home to 550 million Christians, and 20% were from non-Catholic expressions of the Christian faith. These were growing at 3 times the rate of Catholic growth. It has been reported, for instance, that 40 new Pentecostal congregations are begun each week in Rio de Janeiro. By the year 2025, the Christian population in Latin America will grow to 640 million, or roughly the same as Africa. The current pathways of Christianity's pilgrimage, while never possible to chart with total certainty, nevertheless remain relatively clear. As Christianity continues to grow in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, by the end of this century, in 2100, Christians living in the global South and East will number 2.8 billion and be about 3 times more the 775 million Christians projected to be found in the global North. In many ways, we're witnessing a return of Christianity to the non-Western cultures of Asia and Africa, reflecting more the environments which first gave rise to the church. But now, Christianity is embedded in hundreds of cultures and languages, demonstrating an incredible diversity of peoples and places that have welcomed its incarnational presence. This map in 1910 shows by color nations that have a majority Christian population. That's in blue, Muslim is in red, and then Animist and Hindu and Buddhist are in brown and pink and darker pink. That's the picture in 1910. This is the picture in 2010. You can see from that the directions of this shift. The last 500 years of Christianity have also witnessed not only a steady pilgrimage towards the south and then east, but a staggering proliferation of divided institutional churches that never could have been imagined in the first 1,500 years of Christian history. Protestants call separately organized groups of churches denominations, meaning specific associations of congregations with distinct belief and governance. This term makes no sense ecclesiologically to Orthodox and Catholic traditions, which conceive of the church as one entity unified in doctrine and a structure of authority. Yet from the Reformation on, Christians in Europe began organizing themselves into separate and distinct groups. In the democratic, cultural, and religious soil of the United States, such segmentation flourished and then was exported by the modern missionary movement. Thus, Christianity began a process of rapid proliferation into groups denominated from one another, and that process has continued endlessly to the present day. Trying to provide an objective description of our present situation challenges one's ecclesiological imagination. The Center for the Study of Global Christianity at Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary, with help from the Pew Foundation, reported on obtaining information on 41,000 denominations worldwide. A separate website regularly updates these numbers with a present estimate of 43,800 denominations in the world, and it's followed by a note which says, "Please pray for Christian unity." Thus, the pilgrimage of Christianity, measured since the time when the Gutenberg Bible was printed, has witnessed continuous and endless fracturing of its organizational life, and this has spread around the world. The dramatic shift in world Christianity also has intensified the divisions and tensions in the global church and its ecumenical institutions. While the massive growth in the Christian family has come in the global South, financial resources and material power remains concentrated in the global North and West, as seen in this graph. This is a simple graph showing, on the one hand, income, on the right side, income, and on the left side, population, and the disparity is obvious. Geographical divisions are creating serious threats to the sense of unity and mutual belonging, seen especially around issues of money, power, international decision-making, and intellectual theological capital. During the last 100 years, the dramatic geographical pilgrimage of world Christianity was accompanied by the unpredicted advent and eventual eruption of the Pentecostal movement as a powerful force, drastically altering the landscape of the global Christian community. Barely existing a century ago, today 1 out of every 4 Christians in the world is Pentecostal or charismatic, according to the Pew Forum on Religion and Public Life. Along with the story of the growth of the church in Africa, it is hard to name a more critical and formative development in the last century of Christian history. It is estimated, for instance, that 80% of new conversions in Asia are Pentecostal or charismatic. Almost 1 in 4 Pentecostals in the world lives in Asia, and nearly 1 in 3 lives in Africa. What Northern liberal and evangelical Christians often fail to recognize is that Pentecostalism comes to the global South without the history and baggage of colonialism. Churches in the Pentecostal tradition and style, with their emphasis on immediate spiritual experiences, detached Christianity from its white missionary control and empowered indigenous expressions of Christian faith within many parts of the world. The Atlas of Global Christianity, the most comprehensive resource describing the changes in world Christianity in the last 100 years, puts it this way: Pentecostalism became the main contributor to reshaping a Christianity from a predominantly Western to a predominantly non-Western phenomena in the 20th century. This growth in Pentecostal, charismatic, and renewal movements of Christianity has come at nearly 5 times the rate of overall growth of global Christianity, dramatically changing its composition and its theological diversity. Brazil today not only has the largest number of Catholics of any country, but also the largest number of Pentecostals. Meanwhile, in Asia, it is estimated that there are 873,000 Chinese charismatic congregations. These dramatically growing Pentecostal, independent, evangelical, and indigenous churches function largely in a separate world from those comprising the organized ecumenical movement, which is mostly the Orthodox and the historic Protestant churches. The theological gulf between these two worlds has widened as Christianity's center of gravity has continued its journey toward the global South. This divide involves not only doctrinal issues, but also deep differences reflected in the fervent style of spirituality, the less structured and more elastic forms of church polity, along with the convictional witness and focus on church growth found in these freshly emerging forms of Christianity. In my judgment, the gulf between these two worlds, between the world of established Orthodox and mainline in the North and the growing churches in the South, now constitutes the most pressing challenge to the unity of the church in the 21st century. Here's the dilemma. The World Council of Churches has faithfully and courageously carried out the vocation of Christian unity for the past 65 years. Yet it is comprised of only 349 denominations or member churches in the face of over 40,000 denominations now present. Yet new approaches are emerging. The most promising is called the Global Christian Forum, begun as a proposal arising out of the World Council's assembly in Harare in 1998. The Global Christian Forum has become a fresh and credible movement that offers the hope of transcending these divisions. It's been successfully engaging leaders of all the major Christian traditions, Catholic, Pentecostal, Evangelical, Orthodox, and Historic Protestant, in a new circle of global fellowship. Its first major gathering was held in Lamiro, Kenya in 2007. Observers called it a watershed in modern Christian history. A second such gathering took place last year in Manado, Indonesia. Now, the challenges posed by the changing patterns of world Christianity, however, are not only encountered globally. Increasingly, these are being experienced locally. Migration is transforming the religious life of Europe and North America. This has always been so, of course. Religious migrants have shaped the history of Christianity in the United States, but attention needs to be focused on how that reality is continuing today in ways often not fully understood or appreciated. Commonly, we view immigration as introducing large numbers of non-Christian religions into U.S. society. Important scholars like Harvard's Diana Eck have documented the fascinating increase in religious pluralism in the United States, particularly in her classic work, A New Religious America. Yet, the popular assumptions about the impact of immigration on non-Christian religious practice in the U.S. often disregard more fundamental realities. In fact, immigration to the U.S. is having its most dramatic religious effects on the Christian population of the country. That's because, first of all, an estimated 60% of all present immigrants arriving in the United States are Christian. Moreover, they come with practices, traditions, and expressions of their faith that have been shaped in a non-Western context. As the introduction to a new major study on religion in these new immigrant states, even though significant numbers of new immigrants are Christian, they are expressing their Christianity in languages, customs, and independent churches that are barely recognizable and often controversial for European ancestry Catholics and Protestants. But these new Christian immigrants will have a dramatic effect on America's future religious life in ways that we're already beginning to experience. Consider this. According to the 1990 census, 19.7 million people in the U.S. were born in another country. By 2010, there were 43 million foreign-born residents in the United States. And of these, 74% were Christian, 5% were Muslim, 4% Buddhist, 3% Hindu. While these proportions will shift somewhat in the future, the overwhelming reality is that immigration to the United States is having its major effects on the Christian population in this country. Not surprisingly, the highest number of immigrants coming to the United States are from Mexico, totaling 12.9 million. 95% of these are Christian. The Philippines provides the second largest number, totaling 1.8 million, nearly all of whom are Christian. And then out of the 1.1 million immigrants from El Salvador in the U.S., 1 million worship in Christian churches, along with 7,400,000 from the Dominican Republic, 700,000 from Guatemala, and 860,000 from Cuba. Worldwide, there are an estimated 214 million people who are migrants, meaning they are living in a country different from where they were born. Nearly half of these migrants are Christians, about 105 million, far more than the proportion of Christians in the world, which is about 33%. The reasons for this are complex, but yet it's a clear fact. And for these Christians who are on the move, often the United States is their chief destination. Presently, 32 million, or 13% of the Christian community in the U.S., is comprised of migrants, those who were born in another country, and that percentage will continue to rise. Not only do the numbers of these Christian migrants to the United States tell this story, it's also the intensity of their belief in religious practice. Jehu Honkless, a native of Sierra Leone, who now is chair of World Christianity at the Chandler School of Theology in Atlanta, has done pioneering studies of non-Western Christianity. He observes this: certainly, the vigorous growth of immigrant churches and congregations in metropolitan centers throughout the country over the last 3 to 4 decades suggests that they represent the most dynamic and thriving centers of Christian faith in America. Hankles observes that, quote, every Christian migrant is a potential missionary, unquote. And indeed, many African Christians, drawn to the U.S. for a variety of reasons, come with a missionary mindset reflective of the congregations that have nurtured their faith. While immigrants from Africa to the U.S. comprise a modest share of the country's foreign-born population, only about 3.9%, the growth of this community is striking. In 1960, 35,355 African-born residents were living in the United States. 50 years later, that number has increased 40-fold to 1.5 million. And many bring non-Western expressions of Christianity which has been nurtured in the soil of Africa. A decade ago, I struck up a conversation with Rufus Osatello, who was primate of the Church of the Lord Adelora. This was during a meeting of the WCC Central Committee. I knew almost nothing about his church. He shared with me that he had been working as a computer expert in Germany, but had been called to the position of primate of his church, which was headquartered in Nigeria. As we talked together on a pleasant day in Geneva at the beginning of September, Rufus told me he had just recently come from a special time of retreat with prayer and fasting held each year. The primate explained that the leadership of the church gathers together and no major decisions are made without this special period of prayer and fasting. Further, he said that at the end of that period, the wider members of the church are invited to come and share in this experience of retreat and prayer. Anxious to learn more, I asked Primate Osatello how many people from the church at large joined at the conclusion of this retreat. He replied, about 1 million. Suddenly I realized I was talking with the leader of a church whose scope and ministry was beyond anything I had imagined. Founded in 1930 by 28-year-old Joshua Osatello, who had severed his ties from colonial Anglicanism, the church has grown to 3.6 million members. Congregations flourish not only throughout Nigeria, but in other neighboring African countries such as Liberia, as well as Great Britain, Germany, and the United States. The Church of the Lord Adelora is just one example of thousands of such churches belonging to the Organization of African Instituted Churches. This organization represents about 60 million Christians in denominations and congregations throughout the continent and in the African diaspora. Totally independent from the church structures of Western mission, the African instituted churches forged indigenous expressions of Christian faith, often in opposition to the harsh and controlling forces of colonial rule. Increasingly, African instituted churches are finding homes within the United States through the migration of Christians from Africa. Now, in 1965, President Lyndon Johnson stood at the Statue of Liberty and signed the Immigration and Naturalization Act. It was called the Hart-Celler Act, a major reform in U.S. immigration law. At the signing ceremony, however, he said, "This bill that we sign today is not a revolutionary bill. It does not affect the lives of millions." The president could not have been more mistaken. The new law eliminated race and national origin as a basis for immigration, and partly this happened because it was right in the middle of the civil rights movement. And it intended to put all nations on an equal footing. It also placed a priority on the reuniting of families as well as admitting those with needed skills. But no one, it's fair to say, envisioned the consequences. For instance, Robert Kennedy, testifying as Attorney General to a House subcommittee, gave this assurance about the possible immigration from Asia under the proposed law. "I would say for the Asian Pacific Triangle, immigration would be approximately 5,000, Mr. Chairman, after which immigration from that source would virtually disappear. 5,000 immigrants would come the first year, but we do not expect there would be any great influx after that." In fact, the 1965 Act was a watershed in Asian immigration, as well as opening up the flow of non-white immigrants from Latin America, Africa, and the Caribbean. The provision for uniting families had a particularly strong effect on Asian immigration. In 1965, the Asian American population in the U.S. was about 0.5%. By 2002, 7.3 million Asians had arrived in the U.S., significantly exceeding Robert Kennedy's estimate. According to the 2010 census, now 17.3 million Asian Americans are residents of the United States. And in the last decade, the Asian American population grew by 46% faster than any other racial group. The Census Bureau estimates that this group will grow to 40 million by the year 2050. The Christian community in the United States has been notably affected by this influx of Asian immigrants. Sociologists estimate that about 44% of all Asian Americans are Christian. And the interesting thing is that this is a higher percentage than that represented in their home countries. For instance, the Korean American community, totaling some 1.7 million, is about 80% Christian, compared to about 30 to 40% of the population of Korea. Further, at least 13% of those studying for the Catholic priesthood in the U.S. are Asian. Many of them are Vietnamese. An impact is also seen from students abroad studying in the U.S. In 2011, 723,000 international students were studying here, 60% of which were from Asia. Among that group, 157,000 were from China. Frequently, these visiting students are welcomed by Chinese American churches and Chinese and Asian Christian fellowship groups on campuses. Such hospitality often leads to conversion as one joins this community of faith, gathering with fellow sojourners in a new land. So Asian American Christians, with their high levels of education and deeply rooted spirituality, will have a growing impact on Christianity in the U.S. Hispanics, either foreign-born or by ancestry, now total 50 million people in the U.S. Almost 33 million are from Mexico. The influx of Mexican immigrants to the United States over the past 4 decades has been unprecedented in our history for a movement of people from any single country. While present practices and economic circumstances now have virtually halted net immigration from Mexico, and that's important to note if you aren't already aware, the birth rate of the overall Latino population in the U.S. will result in substantial growth from this present 50 million residents. About 70% of the Hispanic population in the U.S. is Catholic. This means that about 35% of all U.S. Catholics are now Hispanic, and they have accounted for 71% of the growth of U.S. Catholics since 1960. That figure will continue to rise. In Los Angeles, for example, 70% of Catholics are estimated to be Hispanic. It's critical to realize that Hispanic Catholics bring their own contextualized practices of their faith. Not only is that reflected in the images of the Virgin of Guadalupe throughout Mexican neighborhoods and U.S. cities, their forms of Catholic piety reflect the enculturation of Christianity in Latin America. Moreover, it is estimated that 54% of Latino Catholics identify themselves as charismatic and thus incorporate practices of spiritual healing, speaking in tongues, and gifts of the Holy Spirit common in non-Catholic Pentecostal settings. About 23% of Latinos, however, are Protestant, accounting for a sizable 9.5 million Christians in the U.S. In fact, there are more Latino Protestants in the U.S. than there are Episcopalians. The great majority of these are Pentecostal or evangelical, about 85%. Many can be found in the thousands of storefront churches and chapels that dot Hispanic neighborhoods in large urban areas. So the Protestant world as well is experiencing the rising influence of Latinos with their frequent combination of evangelical theology, Pentecostal style, and social justice commitments. As the Hispanic community, Catholic and Protestant, is projected to grow to 106 million by the year 2050, their presence will become one of the defining features of American Christianity. Global trends will ensure that migration, particularly from the south to the north, as well as from the east to the west, will be a growing part of the world's future. Further, the majority of those on the move will continue to be Christian. And if, in fact, every Christian migrant is a potential missionary, we are witnessing a major non-Western missionary movement in the world. Think of it this way. As the West becomes post-Christian, non-Western Christianity is coming to the West. This reality is particularly present in certain cities in metropolitan areas, states in metropolitan areas. 3/4 of all immigrants are in these 6 states: California, Texas, New York, Florida, New Jersey, and Illinois. Further, major cities become magnets for immigrants. In fact, Los Angeles and New York together are home to a full 1/3 of all foreign-born residents in the United States. Immigrants find their new homes both within major cities but also in suburbs. Chicago, for instance, where I grew up, has 590,000 immigrants in its city limits, but 984,000 foreign-born residents live in Chicago's suburbs. The last decade has also witnessed the rapid growth of immigrants in several other cities through the middle of the country. For instance, Charlotte, Raleigh, Nashville, and Indianapolis all had more than 100,000 foreign-born residents by 2010, and cities with some of the fastest growth rates of immigrants in the past decade include Baltimore, Orlando, Las Vegas, and Atlanta. And recall that about 2/3 of these immigrants are Christians and thus establishing mono-ethnic congregations or joining multiracial churches, finding ways to nurture and deepen their faith in a new land. Congregations of these immigrants are generally not on our ecclesiological radar, yet such congregations are growing. Mark Gornick, in his book Word Made Global, estimates that New York City is host to at least 150 various African immigrant congregations, and hundreds more of immigrant congregations thrive within the radius of that world city. Got behind a little bit. But the picture continues. Minneapolis-St. Paul, for instance, long known for its Scandinavian and German heritage, has seen an influx of immigrants from Africa, Asia, and Latin America. A decade ago, Frieda Ludwig, then a faculty member at Luther Seminary, discovered 67 congregations of Asian immigrants and 73 of African immigrants within the Twin Cities, and that was 10 years ago. Moreover, the faith of Christian immigrants and that of other religious immigrants as well usually becomes stronger and more intense through their experience of immigration. Stephen Warner, a discerning sociologist who has probed deeply the religious significance of immigrants in their congregations, puts it this way: immigrants do not merely cling to what they had before they left their home countries. As religion becomes less taken for granted under the pluralistic and more secular conditions prevailing in the United States, adherents become more conscious of their tradition and often more determined about its transmission. Religion identities nominally assigned at birth become objects of active passion. Now that Christianity is centered in the global South, and non-Western expressions of faith accompany faithful Christian immigrants to the global North, a fresh theological encounter becomes possible and is crucial. What we are experiencing locally, if we are attentive to newly arrived Christian immigrants, reflects how the realities of world Christianity are reformulating theological assumptions and understandings. Andrew Walls, a pioneer in portraying the dynamics of world Christianity, puts it this way: the most striking feature of Christianity at the beginning of the third millennium is that it is predominantly a non-Western religion. What we have long been used to is a Christian theology that was shaped by the interaction of Christian faith with Greek philosophy and Roman law. These forms have become so familiar and established that we have come to think of them as the normal and characteristic forms of Christianity. In the coming century, we can expect an accelerated process of new development arising from Christian interaction with the ancient cultures of Africa and Asia, an interaction now in progress, but with much further to go. The heart of this theological encounter, in my view, centers in the clash of worldviews shaped by Western and non-Western cultures, which then influences the way in which the Bible is read and faith is understood. Consider, for example, how an African worldview shapes one's understanding. The noted African author John Mbiti, author of African Religions and Philosophy, explains that in the traditional African perspective, the distinction between the spiritual world and the material world, which we assume in the West, simply doesn't apply. Harvey Kwiani explains further, the religious world of the African is spiritually vibrant. As such, for the African, the spiritual realm is real, so real that life is not imaginable without it. Africans usually say that the spiritual realm is just as real as the physical realm. It is only invisible, and even though the two of them are distinguished, they cannot be separated. They are interconnected, and they work together. Such a worldview, embedded in various non-Western cultures, collides with the worldviews entrenched in Western culture. Shaped by the Enlightenment and the modern era, what we commonly call a secular framework for shaping culture and society is taken for granted. Simply put, such a view seeks to understand and structure social, political, economic, and cultural life without reference to religious or spiritual realities. Religion is then confined to the private, personal sphere. Optional space for religious practice is certainly guaranteed, but also circumscribed, both intellectually and practically. Now, of course, 1,000 qualifications are in order, but the operating worldview which frames contemporary societies in the West is shaped by secular assumptions that reinforce a practical materialism and a functional individualism. By contrast, non-Western Christianity brings a worldview and understanding of life which challenges various assumptions of modern life in the West and collides with many of these theological views and practices. Noted author and theologian Akunte Akande describes the development of non-Western Christianity in this way. Christianity has blossomed in societies outside the Western Hemisphere and has become more powerful and nuanced in the process. The anti-structural character of the non-Western phase of world Christianity plays itself out in characteristics such as charismatic renewal, grassroots revival, massive exorcism, vibrant house churches, robust indigenization efforts, and effective lay leaderships. Churches from the Third World are vigorously defining Christianity on their own terms. The new day that dawns will permanently alter the place and nature of Christianity in the 21st century. Let me leave you with a picture of what these emerging streams in world Christianity look like. In Ghana, where I visited just 2 weeks ago, a new highway from Accra to Akropong stretches out toward the mountains. At a toll booth, a huge billboard is suspended over the highway with the picture of Nana Akufo-Addo, the presidential candidate of the main opposition party in an election a week away. These words are featured prominently next to his picture, quote, "The battle is the Lord's," 1 Samuel 17:47. The election was last week. He received 47.7% of the vote in Ghana, narrowly being beaten by the incumbent president. Enterprise is everywhere. Small shops, many almost like shacks, sell goods and services, and major intersections often host a marketplace. Among the many shops and advertisements, some stand out, like the Jesus is Lord Business Center and Internet Cafe. We passed the Give Thanks to God tailoring shop, and the Sow in Tears, Reap in Joy welding and pipe fitting establishment. One of the small stands offering bottled water, soft drinks, and fruit was By His Grace Refreshments. A sign reads, Shower of Blessings Painter, with a phone number. Automotive needs can be met at God is King Motors and car dealers. Winding our way up the hill toward Akropong, we passed the Let There Be Light electric shop and the Riches of Glory guest house, as well as the Jesus is Lord fabric shop. And then here in Akropong is the Princess Choice Beauty Palace, with the words over the door, I'm not alone, Jesus is with me. The lines between the secular and sacred, and the material and spiritual, are drawn very differently here than in our culture. And it's the same throughout much of sub-Saharan Africa, which is now 70% Christian. The signs of a non-Christian worldview reveal themselves in simple but illuminating ways. At the Akrofi Christolor Institute of Theology, I asked Professor Andrew Walls, who's now 80, about the conflict in worldviews between Christians in the West and non-Western Christianity. The Enlightenment had a firm boundary between the empirical and the spiritual world, Walls said. Western Christianity even tried to police that boundary. But non-Western Christianity doesn't see that boundary in the same way. So Walls believes that this is a time of theological renaissance in order to figure all this out and to do so together. Some of those who I think will be part of this theological renaissance were the 47 African students who received postgraduate degrees from the Africo Christolor Institute at its commencement ceremony. And while there, Dr. Emmanuel Evans Anfom, now 93, and one of Ghana's most noted educational leaders, received an honorary degree, and in response, he spoke of, quote, the need to break the myth that Christianity was a European religion imported into Ghana. At the front of the sanctuary of the Akropong Presbyterian Church, where the ceremony was held, a sign hangs on the left-hand wall listing the 10 achievable goals of this congregation in the next 5 years. Those goals include to equip every member to win souls for Christ and to disciple them effectively, to snatch as many as the devil has bound, to equip members to live victorious Christian lives. It's not quite the language of First Presbyterian Church in Pittsburgh. But then these following goals are included in the list: to empower children, youth, and women to fight for their rights, to care for the needy and the poor, to collaborate with government and donor agencies in the fight against poverty, ignorance, and disease. This combination of language with highly spiritualized terms sounding like spiritual warfare, and then clear injunctions to seek social justice and empower the marginalized, sounds dissonant and even jarring to the ears of many in the West. But in countless African countries, this seems to flow together naturally. A week ago Saturday, I was part of a small delegation visiting the Word Miracle Church International in Accra. This is a representative of a new group of megachurches in Africa and beyond. In 1994, its founder, Bishop Agwan Lasari, moved to Accra to center his ministry there in the nation's capital. About 70 people were in worship. 18 years later, 7,000 worship at the main center in Accra. 2 services each Sunday are in English and 1 in Twi, a local language. 2 more are in French, and a youth church and a teen church worship separately. The large worshiping groups meet in the Paris Dome, still under construction, but it's regarded as the largest auditorium in Ghana. The church's ministry extends through many branches, more than 150 throughout Ghana. So we asked, what accounted for this remarkable growth and outreach? The response, tangible miracles. The word is preached, and healings with signs and wonders take place. Bishop Lasari has a worldwide ministry, having preached in 52 countries. He was holding services in the Philippines when we visited. He's written 25 books, and you can follow him on Twitter, join his Facebook page, read his blog, and see the church's ministry on YouTube. His television broadcasts reach throughout Africa and also to the Netherlands and the United Kingdom. Most likely, he's one of the more interesting personalities in today's global church that you've never heard of. The World Miracle International Church is entirely self-sustaining, not relying on outside funding. The church's branches have moved beyond Ghana into other African countries, and they've also extended to Germany and Italy as its members include migrants on the move. Moreover, we were told about a member converted through the ministry of the church who led its youth ministry for several years. Then, more recently, he was sent as a missionary to Maryland. We are, beyond any doubt, at one of those hinge points in Christian history. When the Gutenberg Bible was printed, its eventual consequences were unimaginable. Now, an equally profound movement is occurring as the rising centers of Christian vitality have become detached geographically and culturally from the places in the North and the West, which for so long have been Christianity's dominant, comfortable home. We can project the demographic features of this future. Those alone are stunning. But it's far more difficult, but more decisive, to ascertain the spiritual, theological, and ecclesiological features of this future. That discernment can only happen by walking together on a common pilgrimage. And so the pilgrimage of world Christianity will proceed as a post-Christian West encounters a non-Western church. Thank you. Thank you very much. We have some time for questions, which I'd be delighted to answer, to have our dialogue. Carolyn will kind of call the time, but maybe for about 10, 15 minutes, I'd love to hear. And Jason has the microphone, so please.
Wes, that was such a rich lecture and exquisitely signed. 3 quick questions. You can attend to any of them that are interesting to you. To what extent is Christianity across the globe an aspirational religion that you found? Converts trading up, as it were, which is often the skepticism of the individual. Second is, how does one define a Christian given cultural versus doctrinal? So is a Christian one who's born into a culture, holds a personal belief, or just self-defines? And then the third is the theological immediacy of Pentecostalism mimicking or fed by animistic religion historically? Thus has not, animism evangelized Christianity, perhaps ironically?
Yeah, those are excellent and also complex questions. On the first one, are we seeing basically aspirational, and you're thinking of the prosperity gospel and so forth. You see several things, but the most important study was one done by Donald Miller and Theodore Yamamori at the University of Southern California, who wanted to look at congregations in the world, especially the third world, the global south, that were having a positive social impact. And by a survey, they found 400 of them. They proceeded then to visit 200 over a period of 3 to 4 years and conducted scores of interviews. They discovered that 85% of these congregations were Pentecostal. And they were engaged in what they called a progressive Pentecostalism, because they were in solidarity with the marginalized. Many of you have heard it said that liberation theology was a theology of the poor, about the poor, but Pentecostalism has become the church of the poor. And that kind of engagement leads to social outreach. Now, for some, it's aspirational because they're very, very poor. But I think you've got a variety of things happening with Pentecostalism, and to simply say it's all otherworldly, doesn't affect reality, is really a misjudgment. And it's their book, Global Pentecostalism, which is the best single study on the subject. The second, about defining, most sociologists I've discovered while being here at the Kluge Center and reading a bunch of this stuff, they really go by self-definition. Who's a Christian? That's a huge question, and the big question behind the question is who determines who's a Christian? And so the answer is those who self-define themselves as Christians are regarded as Christians. So all the statistics I've read when I've said Christian, it means those who call themselves that way. The third one, immediacy of Pentecostalism and animism. As one who's really just beginning to learn about a lot of this, especially in the African culture, which is what intrigues me the most, there are several intersections. The basic understanding of spirituality, which is beneath any religious conviction I already referred to, and it permeates life. Likewise, the whole understanding of community. Now, there are certainly some animistic practices that have a resonance with forms of Pentecostal expression. And that's part of what African theologians now are trying to figure out. Because always we're in this dance between what is the faith and what is culture, and so much of the faith exported to Africa was exported with Western garments that have to be torn off and then rediscovered within its context. So those would be answers to those questions.
Thank you very much for a fascinating lecture. I always think a good lecture is one that raises questions in our mind. I wanted to ask you also the relationship between, you began with the Gutenberg Bible and the spread of literacy. Are we seeing the same thing with the Pentecostals? In other words, is there a relationship to literacy or illiteracy? In other words, is it easier to worship with or without a book? Is there a book that guides the believers, or is it more expressions of Christianity rather than the thinking out of Christianity through literacy, the way it was done at the beginning with the Gutenberg Bible and the spread of literacy?
Yeah. Again, there are people who could answer that so much better than me, including like Lamin Sana, who is one of the experts and who was here also as a fellow at the Kluge Center, and whom I've spent very fruitful times learning from. But in general, I'd say two things. You're right that Pentecostalism puts a greater expression on experience rather than on simply the written word. And that's one of the differences. If you talk to, people say, what's the difference between an evangelical and a Pentecostal? If you talk to an evangelical, the evangelical will say, what do you believe? If you talk to a Pentecostal, the Pentecostal will say, what is your experience? And there's a difference. Now, at the same time, the Bible, in the way it has been translated, and as you would know from others who have really studied, The translation of the Bible has had an incredible effect on the literacy and development of language and culture as a side effect that becomes one of its unintended consequences. And with Pentecostals, they still take the Bible very seriously, but they appropriate it in much more direct and experiential ways rather than in dogmatic and systematic ways. That would at least be my impression.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me? This was an excellent lecture. Thank you very much. I have a question about indigenous African Christianity, such as that found in the Horn of Africa and Eritrea and Ethiopia, where the majority are Orthodox Christians, and sort of the parallels or the differences between indigenous Christianity and that which came as a result of colonization in other parts of sub-Saharan Africa.
Yeah, and I didn't mention, there are two great Christian traditions in Africa that I didn't touch upon because I was focusing on sub-Saharan. But the first is the Orthodox tradition in the Ethiopian church, and the second is the Coptic church in Egypt. And in both cases, they're very ancient expressions, and they have a deep connection to the culture. It's interesting that when the African Instituted Churches organization was founded, one of its first members was the Coptic Orthodox Church. Because we were founded indigenously and had nothing to do with imported colonialism, and they still function within that group. But there are vast differences in their style, as you'd imagine. But you've drawn attention to two very important parts of religious life in Africa that I didn't touch on. I think the people with the mics are calling on the people.
Do you believe that the Episcopal Anglican Church is fighting your presentation? In other words, they have a major group of Anglican people from Africa, and they're just not listening to them. And thus, there's a breakup of the Episcopal Church in this country, and they're having a real difficulty. Is this part of what you're talking about?
Well, yes, it is. And I didn't talk about that, but in the book that I finished, I am addressing that. I'll say very briefly that the issue around same-sex relationships is not an issue that is at the priority agenda of the Global South. It's an issue of the Global North, and we're fighting about it in some very difficult ways. We are importing that into the Global South. When you talk to those who are in churches in the Global South, number one, first of all of them, most of them are very conservative on this issue. There's no question. You have a few exceptions like Desmond Tutu and some other prominent bishops. Most of them are very conservative, but at the same time, you sit and talk to them and say, this is not our issue. It's being injected there in the same way that we've constantly injected our agenda and our thought patterns into their religious life. And the worst example is in Uganda, where what's happening in Uganda was precipitated by North American evangelicals. So, while on the one hand, I'd say that there's no question that churches in the Global South are very conservative on those issues, but at the same time, it's not the issue that they put at the top of their agenda. They've got many more directly pressing issues to deal with, and we make a great mistake when we try to triangulate them and get them involved in our own debates. Excuse me, but that's... One more. Could you get Joy here? Or okay.
About how immigrants hold on to the traditions they bring here. What do we know about the religious orientations of second and third generation?
Yeah, it's a huge and fascinating question. I'll just indicate some of what I've learned in my reading and study during the time that I've been here, and also some of my experience as General Secretary of our church, because we had that same phenomenon within, say, our Asian and Latino. The wrong answer is that your first generation comes and they don't assimilate well. They have kids. The kids learn the language. The kids learn the culture. And after 1 to 2 generations, they become fully Americanized. That may have been the way it happened with immigration 100 years ago. It's less the way it's happening now. You find now much more attempts of those who are of the second generation to cling to those parts of their culture which they value and give them an identity, particularly religiously, while appropriating other parts of the culture in which they find themselves. And I think especially for congregations that become multicultural, this becomes a really important issue, because the point is not to homogenize people into one, globalized culture that's defined by Starbucks. The point is to allow the distinctiveness of cultures to grow and to relate together in ways that then create a new reality. And that's a very, very important issue for immigrant churches today.
Please thank our speaker again and join us for reception.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.